Good evening. My name is Richard Smith, and I'm the host of Issues. Our issue this week is intercultural marriage. What is it all about? Does it work? Is it for Bermuda? And we will find out. This evening we have with us as our first guest, Pastor PastorSchnull. Good evening, Pastor, and welcome to Issues.
Good evening, Richard.
Tell us, where do you pastor?
I'm the pastor of the Pembroke Seventh-day Adventist Church right now.
Very
Mead
good.
Road.
Now, you are married to a lady of color. Tell us about your wife, please.
My wife, her parents are Jamaicans, and she was born in England. That's where I met her.
Okay.
And yes, she's darker than me.
Okay.
And so I'm German. I was brought up in Germany. Then moved over to England. That's where I met her. And that's...
Tell me a little bit. You said your background is German. So you were brought up in a German home.
Yes, I was born in Germany,
Yeah.
raised in a standard German home, German parents, German brother, everything German. And then when I was 21, I left Germany to study in England, just English, as a foreign language, for what was meant to be just 1 year turned into 2 years. And then there was a break, and then I went back to England in '91 for good. Well, until I came to Bermuda, that is.
Now, in your home of origin, as you were brought up, did you know of black people? Did you see black people around? Or?
Well, interesting question. I've asked myself that as well, sort of digging back into my memories. And I consciously think I met my first black person when I was in my I think it's the early teens, sort of like 11, 12 years old. Yeah. Because Germany at the time was not very sort of mixed. We had, we call them guest workers from Turkey that emigrated from Turkey in the 60s. And those were the only so-called foreigners in Germany at the time. But black people, very rare, and so it wasn't until I was, like I said, 11 or 12. I can't exactly remember. It was a singing group from England, the Golden Chords. They were from the Midlands in England. They came to our neighboring larger city, Hanover, and they had a gospel night concert. And that was, I think, that was sort of consciously the first time that I saw, black people. And before, of course, you see them on TV, but it wasn't anything like experienced later on when I lived in London, where you walk into the street and you see all shades of humanity. Germany was predominantly white, and like I said, with a smidgen of people from Turkey.
So in your home, race wasn't an issue because there was only really one race in Germany that time, with the guests, other than the guest workers coming over.
It's interesting because there was, and probably still is in certain quarters in Germany, there was, I experienced a certain amount of prejudice, not against me, but against these guest workers from Turkey, even in my own mind at times. They smell of garlic, and maybe they don't wash. So stereotyping was going on even when I was a child, not necessarily in my family, but in society. Now, I must add that my parents, especially my mum, were always very sensitive to stereotyping and looking down on others who may be different. And so she tried to instill in us sort of values of, look, people may be different, but that doesn't mean they're worse or they're better. They're just humans who are different. Okay. But it may not have been black people at the time when I grew up in Germany, but I did see sort of the mild forms of stereotyping. Now, I say that with the background of a German growing up as a child in the 70s. I was born in '66, and the war had finished 21 years earlier before I was born. And so this whole German historic guilt thing, sort of still loomed over us. When I grew up, gosh, I belonged to the bad guys who gassed the Jews and all the other people who did the Holocaust, and we were the guys who started the war, and we elected Hitler and let him do all this nonsense. And so...
Listen, let me interrupt you.
Sure.
Now, you said your mother was sensitive. and you brought up Hitler and the war, it would make me think then that probably back then most Germans probably would be sensitive to the issue of race.
Exactly, and that's why I bring that up, because even, so that's the sort of dichotomy, that you have a society that had gone through this just a generation earlier in the 30s and 40s during the Nazi era. And now here I was as a young child in the late 70s tackling, that's why I called it the milder forms of stereotyping.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I mean, it's not a difference in degree, it's, I mean, a difference in kind, it's just a difference in degree, because that sort of stereotyping was what started the you know, that the Nazis in the 40s, 30s utilized that sort of mechanism of stereotyping to generate the hatred in the society against, for example, the Jews. And now here I was with dealing with the Turkish guest workers as a child, and I'm glad that I grew up in a home that didn't encourage that and says, yeah, in it, because they don't, you know, they're from Turkey and that's why they're no good. No, my mom really strictly said, no, you know, you must never talk like this, and they're just as good people as we are. And so maybe that helped me then later on when I left Germany and moved to a much more culturally mixed country in England, and where I then finally met my wife.
Some of our viewing audience may be wondering, well, when you're going to be talking about this interracial marriage, it's very important to understand the background of an individual in terms of them growing up, what was happening in the home, because many times what you experience in your home, you later grow up experiencing and having the same thoughts later on. So it's important for us to understand the environment that the pastor grew up in. Now, 21, you're in England, it's filled with multicultural people, and how did you meet this black lady?
Well, that didn't happen until about 9 years later.
Okay.
When I moved to England the first time, I went to boarding school, and my roommate was a similar background to my wife later on. Is a black, British-born young man. His parents were Jamaicans, just like my parents-in-law are Jamaicans. And that was the first time. So I roomed with this young man. He's now a pastor in England, Andrew. And I learned some of the things that you wouldn't read in the books about growing up as a black person in England, where the English population says, you're not one of us. You know, they ask you, he would tell me, Steph, they asked me, so where are you from? And I say, well, I'm from Birmingham. And they said, no, where were you born? Well, I was born in Birmingham. And I said, no, where were your parents from?
Yeah.
From Jamaica. Oh, so you're Jamaican.
Yeah.
But then you go to the Jamaicans, and they call you, no man, you're foreign. You know, you're not. So you don't belong. And really, I never had it occurred to me until I roomed with Andrew that you can be in a country and not belong to the country, but also not belong to the country of your parents, because neither country accepts you. So you're sort of caught in this limbo state. And that was a revelation to me, because obviously when I grew up in Germany, you know, that's my home country. You never really think about that. Now, fast forward 10 years and I meet my wife. By then I had immersed myself in the
English
subculture.
culture, yeah.
No, actually, no, in the West Indian subculture.
Good. I like that.
My church was black, West Indian. The people that I hung out with most of the time, the food that I ate, most of the time I associated with mostly black West Indian born or second generation, like my future wife was, black people in England. So much so that when I did my master's degree, when I went to London University for my bachelor's degree, I sat in the classroom and there were some English people in that classroom. And that was the first time I really sort of connected with the white English part of society. Of course, you see everybody on the street, but not sort of on the level of, you know, you see them every day, you become friends and you just hang out. And so my background, by the time I met my wife, was very mixed. But I would say predominantly my close friends were, I think, mostly black, or if not all. And sort of my culture of choice at the time was this West Indian British
Yeah.
subculture. And that's where I met my wife.
Okay. Yeah, so Pastor, let me share something interesting with you. Recently, I was talking to some friends, and we were saying, well, how many white pastors does your denomination have? And somebody says, well, you're not thinking of PastorSchnull as white, are you? I had to smile, and I hear you saying you were engulfed in the West Indian culture. Well, what did your white friends think of you being so immersed in the West Indian culture?
It's students at the time in London University, and now even more so, didn't see the world as maybe, you know, my generation or my parents' generations, your generation have seen it sort of neatly categorized along color lines. You know, we were all in the same classroom, and most of my friends were also church friends. And so it wasn't just that in college I had, or in university I had a mixture of Indian, Asian, and English, you know, white English and black English friends. And then in church was predominantly black. So it wasn't just, the difference wasn't just there in color, but also in spirituality, because obviously in university you will hardly find any church people, well, at least I didn't at the time. And so I think they would rather have wondered, why is Stefan hanging out with all these church people, you know, rather than to say, why is Stefan hanging out with all these black people?
Okay.
You know, so I found that really refreshing living in London, and it still is the case that in the metropolitan area of London, and I guess in other countries as well, I can only speak for London, that the distinctions, how we categorize people, is less and less by, oh, you're white, or you're black, or you're Asian. By Asian, British, we mean, you know, Pakistani or from the Indian subcontinent or Bangladesh. We are Asian. And so we don't categorize people like that anymore, but it's more like, oh, you're from North London, or you're from South London, or you go to that university, or you go to that college. And so the categorization is not because it's so mixed, you know, and London historically has been a very mixed.
Yeah, hearing you say that, then maybe it wasn't a big issue with you dating a black person.
No, it wasn't. No.
So did you, there in London, were there any type of prejudices you faced then?
No. The only prejudice that I thought I might face was to do with me being German, because in the 90s, the British press, exactly, you know, especially the tabloid press, likes to pull up the past and remind everybody of the German starting the war and all that. When it comes to football, there's a sort of a rivalry between the English and the German national team. And so whenever there was a World Cup or there was a European Cup and England played Germany in the quarters or in the semi-finals and usually lost, they would bring up in the lead up to the game, you know, there would be all this sort of war references. And so my main concern wasn't so much me being a white guy hanging out with a lot of black people. It was more like to do with, oh, I'm a German and I hope I don't have a swastika sprayed on my car. But that never happened. You know, I never faced any prejudice because I'm German, never faced any prejudice because I'm white in any circumstances, whichever group I was in. No, not in London. I had one snide little remark when later on we lived in the country, and the country may be not quite so educated in terms of mixing, you know, and intercultural maturity. And there was one remark, and again I have to put that in context. For the many years that I lived there, only one remark to do with the war. But no, otherwise no, never faced any prejudice.
Wow. Now, Pastor, you have children. How does this affect their children? If you're in public, you're white, their mother is black, how do you talk about this in your home?
Yes. Now, my son is, I met him when I met his mother. I'm not his biological father, so he's the darkest in the family. And then there's my wife, and then there's our daughter, who's mixed, and then there's me. So that's the color spectrum in our family. The way the Europeans, the way we Europeans invented this whole race system sees only people of my color as white. Everybody else who's darker than me would classically be categorized as black. So even my daughter, who is a mixed, so-called mixed person, would naturally be seen when you first look at her. Oh, you know, she's light, but she's black.
Yeah.
And so I'm quite happy for both my children to feel as black people. You know, fine, they know that their dad is white. I mean, my son may not be my biological son, so I'm not his father, but I am his dad, you know, because I taught him, I brought him up. And I told especially my daughter, I told them that, look, you know, I may be white, but when people look at you, they will think you being black.
Yeah.
And don't even let black people tell you, hey, no, you're not black because your dad was white. No. If you live in a racially stratified society that still adheres to these you know, categorizations, it doesn't matter. You know, in North America, I think it was the one drop
makes
something.
black.
Yeah. And so people would look at my daughter and she would not be categorized, you know, as white.
Right.
Now I'm quite happy if she chooses to think of herself as mixed or other, or I'm both. That's fine with me as well, because I also told my kids that, look, this whole race thing, black, white, and so forth, is actually an invention, a sociological construct that was invented by us Europeans. If you dig below the surface of the skin, if you go into genetics and so forth, the whole thing just crumbles and falls apart. You know, so genetically, Richard, you and I are very close, even though when people look at us, they may think, well, there's a black man and there's a white man.
Let me, you brought this up. Do you know, on applications and so forth, what would your daughter, what would she tick? White, black, other, do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I'm glad that these days these you know, lists have become a little more comprehensive, and they allow for people like my daughter's background, of my daughter's background, to take, not just to choose between white and black. You know, so there's now mixed of white, British, Caribbean descent. So you have all sorts of mixed scenarios also on the form that you can take.
Yeah, that's very
so it's not just other anymore. It's actually has a couple of
that's very true.
choices there.
Now, you told us what it was like in London. How have you found the Bermudian community in terms of interracial, intercultural marriages?
Similar, I must say. You know, I was happily and pleasantly surprised when we arrived in Bermuda and found out that we're not the only mixed couple on the island. And so I'm glad to see that here in Bermuda you have a certain amount of mixing going on. So my daughter is not the only person on the island that has a mixed, you know, mixed parent, what do you call it, parentage, whatever, background. And so that was encouraging, you know, so we were not sort of exotic. Ooh, look, there come the people from England, oh wow, look, he's white and she's black. No, it's I've seen it, and it always encourages me when people sort of step across the boundaries and start mixing. You know, to me that's encouraging. And I found it in Bermuda, and that was good to see.
Very, very good. Now, when your family's home and they may be watching a TV show and the discussion might be race, is there an uncomfortable feeling in the family, or, you know, it doesn't bother us, we'll listen, you know, we'll make our decision, but it doesn't affect us, we don't feel uncomfortable, we don't feel out of place?
No, I remember my wife brought home the full DVD set of Roots. Now, when I grew up, I had heard about it, but never watched it. And so here we were, our family, and we were going through one DVD after another, you know, watching Roots. And I began to realize how, because when I grew up, let me just backtrack a bit what you said earlier, sometimes the background helps. I often wondered, God, why on earth was I born in this German country with all this background, with all this historic, mess and guilt and having to deal with that, and I wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
And I managed to do that. Now here I was, a white guy, sitting there with my black family watching Roots, where the white people don't really come off that well,
Right.
because it's a historical fact that most of white people in that time, you know, when they were involved in the slave trade, they were on the wrong side. But I had learned to associate, to even be associated with, or to associate myself with the group that did that wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had to when I was in Germany. Now here I am in Bermuda, a white European, and although Germany was not sort of as involved in the slave trade as Great Britain and North American whites were, just by the fact that I'm a white person, I could easily be placed in that category. You know? So, okay, you are, you know, that was your people who did that.
Yeah.
And I had learned through going through the history in my own thought processes of being a German, coming to terms with that, yes, my grandparents' generation did that. They built Auschwitz, they gassed the people in Treblinka, they murdered the folk in the Warsaw ghetto. My grandparents' generation did that. Normal Germans, you know, shooting people just because they thought they were scum. And I learned how to live with that. So now here I am watching Roots, and I can watch it without sort of cringing and feeling all guilty and oh my gosh, what are my family going to think about me now? You know, is my daughter going to look at me now as a slave trader? You know, we're going to sell her to and she become the mother of Chicken George. No, you know, we are then able to talk about it. We were able to watch it, and we never really had that sort of. There was never any tension.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even watching Roots in our family, and even Barbara's parents, my wife's parents, who were Jamaicans, even my own parents.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we never had any major problem with the fact that we married across the color line, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my mom once sent me a letter where she read in an old book by an author, Ellen White, where she warns people against interracial marriage especially because of the children. And so I called her, I said, Mom, look, that was written in the 1800s when folk would come to you and would kill you for marrying somebody outside your race because they think you're messing with the bloodline and all that rubbish. And immediately she understood, and she was happy. And
yeah, you brought up religion. Let's just focus on that a little bit. Have you found in your experience, be it in London or here in Bermuda, or wherever you might have lived, that maybe those of us who claim to be religious and spiritual, that maybe we are more accepting or less accepting than folks who don't claim to have any religion at all?
I find that when you are a true follower of Christ, you know, I want to make that distinction, because not every religious person is also a follower of Christ. You know, some of us, we wear the religious label, but really have not allowed Christ to change our hearts. So let's talk about a true follower of Christ, who's had a proper change of heart, change of priorities, change of viewing the world, because they've now accepted Jesus as their Lord. Those kind of people, no problems, because the Bible is quite clear that all of us humans, we have a common ancestry. And so we always say as pastors, you know, the level in front of the cross is the ground in front of the cross is level, it's even. Nobody's better than the other. Now, and so among the genuine followers of Christ, never had a problem. The others, I don't know. Nobody's ever come to me and, you know, sort of put their finger in my face and told me, hey, you know, you shouldn't be married to a black person, or made any stupid comment, be that a black person or a white person. But then again, maybe it's because I've never really lived in a country where those people live. In London, that wouldn't have happened. I mean, of course, you've got crackpots anywhere you live, anywhere you go, I mean. But I've never met them because there are only a few of them. Here in Bermuda, I haven't seen them. Now, if you know, who knows where the Lord takes us from here? If he puts us in the deep south in the U.S., I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, we always have sort of these ideas that maybe there's some redneck out there somewhere who might think, you know, miscegenation shouldn't happen, he's wrong. But no, in the church, never, I haven't had that experience.
In your experience, and we're coming down to the end now, have you ever gotten any, you or your family ever gotten any stares or what's happening here? You know, they might not have said anything, but as you walk by, you feel these eyes just trained on you. And the only reason that you could come up with is, here's a white man walking with a black daughter, a black son, and a black wife. So.
Yes, it happened, not maliciously or not any hostile stares, but you know, sort of a moment of surprise. When my son and I would go in a shop, and he would shout out to me, "Dad," and then people would look, who's he calling at, and then this white guy is saying, yeah, it's all right. There's this moment of surprise, like, and then you see how people quickly put two and two together. Because they didn't expect that.
Yeah.
You know, when people meet me at the for the first time, and they don't know my family, and then they see my family, there may be a short moment of surprise, because they had put me in the little white box, and then they have to take me out of that box and put me in another box, because you can't judge the book by the cover.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much, Pastor.
Thank you, Richard.
This evening we've been talking to Pastor PastorSchnull. We've been looking at interracial, intercultural marriage. Pastor PastorSchnull, his wife is black, and his children are of black hue. And it's interesting, as he talked to us, he has really never experienced any type of racial prejudice against he or his family, and he has lived in London, and now he is living here in Bermuda. And so once again, Pastor, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Richard.